"Excuse me, miss?" A sharp voice barked, snapping her from her book. She looked up to see a man towering over her. Tall, stocky, and red-faced, with a conductor's cap tilted low on his forehead. His name tag read Mark Wells. He held out his hand, palm open. "Ticket. Now." Anna blinked. "Of course," she said softly, fumbling for the sleek plastic card tucked in her tote's side pocket. She handed it over with a polite smile. Mark snatched it, scanned it, then frowned. "This is fake." Her eyes widened. "Fake." He turned the card over, his lip curling. "We get a lot of these. Kids printing fancy cards online, thinking they're clever. You've got some nerve." Passengers nearby turned to watch. A man 2 rows up leaned into the aisle, whispering to his wife. A middle-aged woman across from Anna gave her a pitying look but said nothing. Anna straightened. "Sir, that pass is valid." "My dad." "Oh, here we go," Mark interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "My dad said I can ride for free. I'm special blah blah blah." He waved the pass in the air mockingly, like a trophy. "Let me guess. Daddy's some lawyer? Or maybe a politician? Kids like you always got a story." A heat rose in Anna's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, I think there's a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," he snapped. "You either pay for a ticket or you get off at the next stop. We don't tolerate freeloaders here." A ripple of whispers ran through the carriage. Anna's fingers curled into fists in her lap. She thought about explaining, about telling him the truth. Her father didn't just know the railway, he owned it. Every train, every track, every employee, from the executives to the janitors, worked for him. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, calm and steady. "Power is quiet, Anna. Don't throw my name around just to win arguments. People show you who they are when they think you have nothing." So she said nothing. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "I'll call my dad," she said simply. Mark barked a laugh loud enough to draw more attention. "Oh, I bet you will. Let me guess, he's on Wall Street? Maybe run a bank? Or better yet, a railroad tycoon." He laughed at his own joke. The other passengers chuckled nervously. A man in a suit muttered, "Kids these days." Under his breath, Anna felt the sting of humiliation, a heavy knot forming in her chest. Her father had always taught her humility. She never wore designer clothes, never flaunted wealth, never asked for special treatment. And yet here she was, being mocked publicly by a man whose paycheck ultimately came from her family's company. She swallowed hard and dialed. "Dad." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The other passengers watched with growing curiosity. Mark stood with his arms crossed, smirking. "Put him on speaker," he said, leaning over her seat. "I'd love to hear his excuse." Anna hesitated but complied. "Sweetheart, everything okay?" Her father's deep voice filled the cabin, calm but with an undertone of concern. "Dad, the conductor says my train pass is fake," she said quietly. There was a long pause on the other end. Then his voice sharpened. "What's his name?" Mark straightened slightly. "Oh, no need to get Daddy involved, princess," he sneered. "We'll just have you off at the next station." The phone crackled. "Sweetheart, hand him the phone." Anna looked up, her dark eyes steady. "My dad wants to talk to you." Mark rolled his eyes but snatched the phone from her hand. "Yeah, who's this?" There was a silence so thick that even the hum of the train seemed to fade. Then, in a voice that was low but commanding, her father spoke. "This is Robert Thompson, owner of Thompson Railways. You're holding my daughter's phone." The blood drained from Mark's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then stammered, "Yes, sir, I expect you to hand her back her pass. Right now." Mark fumbled with the pass, nearly dropping it in his haste. He handed it back to Anna with trembling fingers. "And Mark?" Her father's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Stay where you are. I'll be having a word with you at the next stop." The line went dead. Mark looked like he'd seen a ghost. The whispers around them grew louder. A young man at the back muttered, "Wait, did she just say owner?" A woman whispered to her husband, That's Robert Thompson's daughter? Anna calmly slipped her pass back into her tote and returned to her book, though her heart was pounding. Mark lingered awkwardly in the aisle for a moment, unsure what to do. She didn't look at him. "Have a nice day," she said softly, turning the page. The tension in the cabin didn't ease. The passengers stole glances at her, at Mark, and at each other, sensing something far bigger was about to unfold. The train's rhythm suddenly felt like a ticking clock counting down to some inevitable confrontation. Because Anna knew her father, and if there was one thing Robert Thompson despised more than dishonesty, it was arrogance. Mark thought this was over, but this was just the beginning. The rumble of the train faded into the background as Anna tried to calm her racing thoughts. She flipped another page of her book, though she wasn't reading. Instead, her mind drifted back, through the years, to the story of the man who had built an empire, and to the lessons that shaped her into the girl sitting quietly in this train car, refusing to bow to humiliation. Robert Thompson wasn't born into wealth. He was born in a modest neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where freight trains rattled past his tiny bedroom window each night. As a boy, he loved trains, not for their size or power, but because they represented movement, opportunity, and possibility. By 15, Robert was sweeping floors in a rail yard, his hands black with soot and oil by the end of each shift. He saved every dollar he earned, spending weekends reading library books on business and engineering while his friends played basketball. At 22, he was already a junior engineer at a freight company. By 30, he'd earned a reputation for spotting inefficiencies and solving problems that even seasoned executives overlooked. When the company he worked for downsized, Robert took the severance pay and risked everything. He started Thompson Railways, a regional freight line that everyone said would fail. But Robert wasn't just smart. He was relentless. He spent nights at the yard, fixing engines himself, sometimes sleeping in his office. Within 10 years, Thompson Railways had grown from a struggling freight service into a transportation empire that stretched across multiple states, carrying both freight and passengers. Despite the wealth he accumulated, Robert never forgot where he came from. He didn't believe in flaunting his success. His suits were well-tailored but modest. His cars were reliable, not flashy. And when Anna was born, he vowed to raise her the same way, with humility, hard work, and quiet confidence. Growing up, Anna never felt like the daughter of a tycoon. Their family home, though large and comfortable, wasn't a mansion. Robert and his wife, Lena, believed in creating a sense of normalcy for their daughter. Lena was a former teacher who left the classroom when Anna was born but brought her passion for education home. Their house was filled with books, fiction, biographies, history, science. Anna's favorite afternoons were spent sitting cross-legged in the family library while her mother read aloud, her father popping in from the office to listen for a few minutes before returning to work. By the time she was 10, Anna could identify every type of train engine her father owned. She loved riding with him in the company's observation cars, peering out of wide windows at the countryside blurring past. Those trips weren't just father-daughter bonding moments. They were lessons. "Look closely," Robert would say, pointing out of the window. "See that yard worker fixing a switch? He's more important than I am. Without him, none of this works." She'd nod solemnly, not fully understanding yet. "Titles don't make you powerful, Anna. Respect does. Remember that." As she grew older, Amara realized not everyone treated her like just another kid. At school, classmates whispered about her family's wealth. Some wanted to befriend her for the wrong reasons. Teachers sometimes gave her special treatment, assuming she was different. It made her uncomfortable. So, she learned to blend in. Simple clothes, a quiet demeanor, and a strong work ethic. She didn't flaunt her father's empire. But Robert noticed her frustration. One evening, when she was 14, she sat at the dinner table, tears of anger welling in her eyes after a classmate mocked her for buying her grades. Her father put down his fork and leaned in. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Anna. Let people underestimate you. That's their mistake, not yours. You know your worth." She never forgot that. Thompson Railways had become a symbol of reliability across the Midwest. Its glossy brochures showed smiling conductors, polished train cars, and sleek marketing slogans, moving you forward. But behind the scenes, Anna knew the company wasn't perfect. Despite her father's best efforts, some staff had grown complacent. Conductors like Mark Wells embodied the worst traits of customer service: a sense of superiority, unchecked power, and a disdain for passengers they considered beneath them. Her father fought against that culture, investing in training programs and hiring managers who valued empathy over arrogance. But some bad habits were deeply ingrained, especially among older staff. Robert sometimes confided in Anna about these struggles, especially as she got older. "I can build new trains, new tracks," he said one night while they stood in the maintenance yard, the smell of grease and metal thick in the air. But changing attitudes? That's harder. Anna watched a mechanic climb under a carriage, sparks flying from a welding torch. "Why not just fire them all and start over?" she asked. He chuckled. "Because you don't fix problems by throwing people away. You teach, you give chances. But when someone shows you who they are, really shows you, you hold them accountable." Mark Wells wasn't a new name to the company. He'd been a conductor for over a decade, known for his punctuality and sharp eye for detail. But he also had a temper and a reputation for humiliating passengers who made mistakes. He'd once publicly berated a young mother for losing her ticket while juggling a crying toddler, forcing her to pay again. Another time, he'd kicked a homeless man off a train despite company policy that allowed certain charitable passes. Robert had received complaints about Mark, but Mark was always clever enough to cover himself, citing company rules or safety concerns. He'd never been caught outright violating policy. Until now, this particular trip wasn't meant to be dramatic. Anna had spent the morning visiting a friend in Chicago and was headed back home for the weekend. She'd chosen to ride one of her father's trains instead of flying because she loved the steady rhythm of train travel, the soft sway, the click of wheels, the landscapes sliding by. She dressed simply as always. Her tote bag held nothing but a book, her phone, and her train pass, a black and gold card issued only to senior executives and their families. It granted her unrestricted access to any train in the company's network. When she boarded, she noticed Mark immediately. He carried himself like a man who thought he owned the train, his sharp uniform meticulously pressed, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He barked orders at passengers struggling to store their luggage, his voice sharp and impatient. Anna quietly slipped into her seat, hoping to remain invisible. She'd almost made it. They were strangers then, but in the hours to come, they would all become witnesses to a story they'd tell for years, the day a conductor's arrogance collided with quiet power. Some would later admit they'd assumed Anna was just a teenager trying to get a free ride. Others would confess they were too afraid to speak up, even when they sensed she was telling the truth. None of them would forget the moment the train screeched to an unexpected stop. The sky outside grew darker as rain pattered against the windows. The lights in the cabin flickered slightly, and the train's hum deepened as it gained speed. Anna shifted in her seat, her book resting loosely in her hands. She had no idea that this quiet trip would become a lesson her father had always warned her about: that kindness can be mistaken for weakness, and that humility often reveals the true nature of those around you. And Mark Wells was about to reveal everything. The storm outside had intensified. Rain lashed against the windows in relentless sheets, and the faint roll of thunder made the train feel like a cocoon moving through a world on edge. Inside the cabin, the soft hum of conversation and the occasional squeak of shoes against the aisle floor created a low, restless soundtrack. Anna shifted in her seat, pulling her sweatshirt tighter against the cool blast of the overhead vent. She tried to lose herself in her book again, but the words blurred on the page. The tension from her earlier exchange with Mark still clung to her like static. She could feel his presence even before he reappeared. His footsteps, measured, deliberate, echoed down the aisle, louder than they needed to be. Mark Wells was making his rounds, ticket scanner in hand, his posture rigid as though he were patrolling enemy territory rather than serving paying passengers. He checked tickets with sharp, impatient gestures, barking out seat numbers, making notes on his tablet. Every interaction seemed tinged with irritation. When he reached Anna's row, he stopped. "You!" he barked, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the cabin. She looked up calmly, though her stomach twisted. "Yes." He held out his hand. "Show me the pass again." A flicker of annoyance passed over her face, but she complied, fishing the sleek black and gold card from her tote. He snatched it, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over in his hand as though he were analyzing a counterfeit bill. He frowned. "Yep," he muttered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Still fake." A ripple of whispers passed through the rows around her. A young man 2 seats ahead glanced back, brows raised. Anna's voice was calm but firm. "It's not fake." Mark chuckled, a humorless sound. "Sweetheart, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen every scam there is. This is a good one, I'll give you that. Glossy finish, company logo, barcode. But it's not in our system. That means you printed it yourself or someone did it for you." "I didn't." "Save it," he snapped, cutting her off. "You can either pay for a ticket now or get off at the next station. Your choice." Anna's hands clenched into fists in her lap, but she didn't raise her voice. "Sir, I'm telling you, this pass is valid. If you scan it properly." "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job?" He scoffed, his lip curling into a sneer. "Cute, real cute. You kids think you're so smart. A little Photoshop and you think you can ride free." Someone chuckled softly from across the aisle. A man in a suit muttered, "Entitled brat." Anna's cheeks burned, but she held Mark's gaze. "I'll call my father," she said again, her voice steady but soft. Mark leaned closer, bracing one hand on the seat in front of her. "Oh, please, do it. Let's hear from Daddy. Maybe he's a lawyer? Maybe he's a senator? Or maybe he's just another guy who thinks his precious daughter doesn't need to pay like the rest of us." His words dripped with disdain, and his breath smelled faintly of coffee and mint gum. Anna leaned back slightly, her heart pounding. She could feel every pair of eyes in the car on her now. The young mother a few rows away hugged her toddler closer, whispering something to her husband. The elderly couple stirred from their nap, blinking in confusion. The businessman with the laptop pretended to work but was clearly listening. Mark straightened and turned to the other passengers, as if inviting their judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when you let kids think they're above the rules. She's got a fake pass and thinks she's clever. Should I let her ride for free, folks?" There were murmurs of agreement from some passengers. One man laughed and said, "Kick her off." Anna's throat tightened, but she refused to cry. She could almost hear her father's voice in her head. "Power isn't loud, Anna. Don't let them see you flinch." She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. "Dad." Her voice was calm but had a tremor at the edges. On the other end, Robert Thompson's deep voice carried warmth and concern. "Hey, sweetheart, you sound tense. What's wrong?" "The conductor says my pass is fake." There was a pause, a dangerous pause. "Who?" His voice was sharper now. "His name tag says Mark Wells," Anna said softly. Robert inhaled deeply. She could picture him sitting in his office, his expression unreadable but his mind already moving like clockwork. "Put him on the phone," he said. Mark let out a bark of laughter. "Oh, this is rich. Put me on with Daddy." "Sure thing, princess." He snatched the phone from her hand. "Yeah, this is Conductor Wells. Who am I speaking with?" "This is Robert Thompson." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mark's smirk faltered slightly. "And who are you?" he asked, voice wavering just slightly. "I own Thompson Railways," Robert said calmly. "And you're holding my daughter's phone." Mark froze. The color drained from his face. A few passengers gasped audibly, whispers rippling through the cabin. "Yes, sir. I didn't realize." "You didn't need to realize," Robert interrupted, his voice low but commanding. "You had no reason to humiliate my daughter, Mr. Wells. No reason to accuse her without scanning the pass correctly. No reason to mock her in front of paying customers. Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I want you to hand her back the phone and stay right where you are," Robert said. "Do not leave that car. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He handed the phone back to Anna, his hands trembling. "Sweetheart?" Robert's voice softened. "Are you okay?" "Yes, Dad," she said quietly. "I'll handle this. Stay calm." The call ended. Mark stood there awkwardly, his face pale. The passengers were silent now, the tension in the cabin thick enough to choke on. The train rumbled on through the storm, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Passengers whispered to one another, stealing glances at Anna and Mark. The businessman who had muttered, "entitled brat," earlier now looked uncomfortable. The young mother offered Anna a sympathetic smile. Mark retreated to the front of the car but kept glancing back nervously. His confident stride was gone, replaced by stiff, uneasy movements. Anna returned to her book, though her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt heavy. Her father's voice echoed in her head again. "Let people underestimate you. That's their mistake." Now they all knew, and there was no going back. Minutes crawled by. The businessman finally leaned over the aisle. "Miss, I'm sorry for earlier." Anna looked up, startled. "I didn't realize." He trailed off, clearly embarrassed. She offered him a polite smile. "It's okay." The elderly woman too rose up, turned in her seat. "Your father's Robert Thompson? The one who built this railway?" Anna nodded. The woman's husband chuckled softly. "Well, I'll be. We've been riding these trains for years. Tell your father he runs a fine company." Anna's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "I will." The young mother spoke up, her voice firm. "What that man did to you was wrong. You didn't deserve that, no matter who your father is." "Thank you," Anna said softly, touched by the kindness. Mark, standing at the front of the car, visibly flinched at the comment. About 30 minutes later, the train began to slow, the brakes hissing as they approached a mid-route station. The passengers looked around, confused. This wasn't a scheduled stop. Mark's face drained of what little color he had left. Anna closed her book and set it in her lap. Her pulse quickened. The train came to a halt with a soft jolt. The doors slid open, and then a team of uniformed railway officials stepped onto the train car. The uniforms that stepped through the carriage doorway weren't the crisp public-facing conductor uniforms passengers expected. These were a small team, 2 in company security polos, a woman in a sharply tailored HR blazer, and a man in plain clothes carrying a slim tablet. They moved with purpose, eyes scanning faces, then stopping when they reached Mark. Mark's jaw tightened when he saw them. He'd been a fixture on this line for 15 years, and even the idea of outsiders boarding like this made him bristle. He squared his shoulders, trying to summon the same iron calm he had used to cow other passengers. "Conductor Wells?" the security lead said, voice polite but firm. Mark glanced back at Anna and the passengers, then swallowed. "Yes, we have a complaint," HR said. "We need to speak with you about an incident in Car B." Mark's mouth opened and closed. Around him, the cabin exhaled, soft, incredulous whispers spreading like ripples. The businessman with the laptop closed his screen and leaned forward. The elderly couple sat straighter. The young mother tucked her toddler even closer. Mark tried the old defense, the one that had gotten him out of trouble before. "The rules. I was enforcing company policy." "You were accusing a passenger of using a fraudulent pass without following procedure." The HR woman cut in. "We have a report. We're collecting statements." Mark looked at Anna, flinching when her eyes met his. He'd thought humiliation was something he could mete out without consequence. Now, under the watchful faces of his boss's passengers, it looked different. "Sir," the security lead said to Mark, keeping his tone even, "we need you to step out to the vestibule and answer a few questions. Please leave your scanner on the aisle seat." Mark's face flushed. Around him, the momentum shifted. The businessman cleared his throat. "You humiliated a passenger." he said, softer now than before. We saw it. An elderly woman too rose up, nodded. It's not how a person should be treated, she said, voice trembling with the quiet righteousness of someone who'd seen injustice before and refused to look away. Mark's facade cracked. She had a fake pass, he said, desperate. I'm a conductor. I know these things. We'll review the scanner logs and the manifest, the plainclothes man said, and we'll be taking statements from any passengers who witnessed the exchange. At that, the young woman who'd been scrolling her phone 2 seats down cleared her throat and stood. I recorded the whole thing, she said. Her hand moved, and the glow from her screen lit her face as she showed the video to the HR woman. The footage began to play on the tablet. Mark leaning over Anna, the harsh laugh, his snarl about daddy's girl. A dozen faces watched the replay, their expressions hardening as they saw the exchange without the filter of rumor or gossip. Mark's voice went very small. He tried to speak, then stopped as the tablet showed his own words. The room seemed to tilt. Someone from the maintenance crew, Alonzo, a wiry man who had worked the night shifts and who had slipped into the carriage to ride home, cleared his throat. He'd been a silent witness to more than he'd liked. The way Mark harried passengers, the way older coworkers shifted uncomfortably when he came by. I filed a complaint once, Alonzo said, voice steady. They said they were looking into it. Nothing happened. Another voice joined, a thin, professional tone that Amara recognized as Claire's. Claire was a conductor like Mark had been once, and she'd covered the morning line for years before switching to mentoring new hires. She stood in a doorway, hands folded. I'd spoken to supervisors about conduct issues with Wells before. We documented incidents. A mother with a crying baby, a man with a disability whose pass he questioned, a college student who couldn't find her wallet after a nightmarish transfer. There were a dozen minor complaints that built into a pattern. Mark's eyes darted to Claire, then away. He felt smaller than he had in years. Mr. Wells, HR said, for now, we're placing you on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. You'll be escorted off at the next station. The word suspension landed heavier than Mark expected. It was the beginning of an unraveling he had always convinced himself he could control. Anna watched all of this with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She hadn't wanted humiliation to be the catalyst for Mark's downfall. She wanted accountability. The sight of him, blustering before he'd been asked to think, was not satisfying so much as necessary. People who were tiny to others since they were small often became huge when given nothing more than an unchallenged script of authority. Is that it? Mark managed to say. His voice had the ragged edge of someone who'd been caught in a lie so many times it no longer mattered. No, Claire said quietly. We're going to do better. Mr. Thompson is here, and he wants to see how the company responds. He asked for this investigation to be thorough. The cabin's hush deepened. The train's rhythm felt distant, as though the car itself was holding its breath. The doors hissed again as the train shuddered into the next mid-route station. A slim, dark sedan idled at the platform. Robert Thompson stepped out, not in the blaze of publicity that Mark might have expected, but in the measured way of a man accustomed to influence used without drama. He didn't storm down the aisle. He walked with the composure of someone who knew the weight of every step. When he reached the carriage, he paused just inside the doorway. People turned. Some rose to their feet out of respect. Some craned their necks for a better look. Anna felt her stomach flip, not from fear of her father, but from the gravity that filled the cabin like a second air. Robert's eyes landed on Mark, then on Anna. There was a warmth when his gaze rested on his daughter, quiet, relieved. Anna, he said simply. Dad, she replied. Her voice was steady. Thank you for staying calm, he said, a private note only she heard. You did the right thing. He turned then to the HR lead and the security team. I asked you to come aboard because I don't want this handled as a PR problem, he said. His voice was carried easily. I want this handled as a people problem. We train, we educate, but we also act when someone crosses the line. He looked directly at Mark. Explain. Mark opened his mouth. He wanted to say he was just enforcing company policy. He wanted to say he had stress at home, that the job had been getting to him. He wanted to beg for mercy. What came out instead was the sound of a man buying time. "Sir, You accused a passenger of theft and fraud without due diligence," Robert said. "You humiliated her in front of others. You've had complaints against you before. That is not in keeping with the values I ask of my staff." Mark's shoulders sagged. I thought. You thought you were right," Robert finished. "That assumes the right to judge. That is not a title you have." Passengers watched, the carriage a theater of a small, decisive justice. The woman who had recorded the video approached Robert with the tablet and handed it over. He watched the playback. His face did not contort with triumph, but with something like sorrow, an acknowledgement that a small injustice had been permitted until it became intolerable. "Mr. Wells," the HR director said, "effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal inquiry. We will review your prior conduct and the complaints on file. We will consider retraining and restorative measures, but we cannot permit this behavior to continue." The words landed like a gavel. Mark's face went from color to color. Passengers shuffled. Some breathed out like they'd been holding their breath. The elderly couple clasped hands. The businessman who'd first muttered entitled brat had his head bent, embarrassed for his earlier snap judgment. Mark's protest crumpled. "Please, my family, I understand," Robert said. "But understanding does not excuse action. We will ensure fairness in the process. In the meantime, we expect a public apology to the passengers and, privately, to Ms. Johnson." It was the final humiliation, rendered by the very structure he had hoped to wield. Mark's voice broke on the apology. He muttered it, a scraped-together sound, but the sincerity felt thin. Claire stepped forward. "I want to say something," she said. "This has been happening in smaller bites for years. If we're serious about a culture of respect, we need more than suspensions. We need training for staff, accessible complaint channels for passengers, and measurable accountability." Robert nodded. "You'll have it. We'll be rolling out a new initiative across the company. Mandatory empathy training, a whistleblower protection program, and a passenger feedback system that triggers review for conduct complaints. No one will be above scrutiny." There was a hum of approval. A woman in the back, who had been silent through most of the ordeal, leaned forward. "That will change things," she said. "I'm tired of seeing people bullied and thinking there's nothing to be done." Anna watched her father with a complicated pride. He had the power to crush but chose instead to build structures that made future cruelty harder. That, Anna knew, had always been his way, useful, quiet power. By the time the train reached the next major station, the story had taken on its own small orbit. A few passengers uploaded their videos. The conversation on the platform hummed with indignation and support. A local news van idled by the curb. Someone had tipped them off. There are always eyes for human drama that plays like a moral test. Mark was escorted off with his head bowed. He was not dragged in cuffs, but he was led away from the track he'd thought he owned. As the doors closed behind him, some passengers applauded softly. Others sat in reflective silence, uncertain whether applause was the right response to watching another human's life wrench itself. Robert stayed until the security team had filed their initial reports. He spoke to Claire and the HR director in calm, practical tones about policy and implementation. He taught people to look beyond headlines and to see the systems that let bad behavior persist. Anna stood beside him, small and steady. At one point, a young father approached her, eyes bright. "Thank you for not fighting back," he said, voice thick. "It took more courage to hold your ground than to shout." She smiled faintly. "I didn't want to make it about my name," she said. "I wanted it to be about what was right." A few days after the incident, Thompson Railways issued a public statement that they were investigating a conduct complaint, that they were implementing a new training program, and that they welcomed feedback from passengers. The statement didn't gloat. It accepted responsibility. The media picked up the story, but the narrative that stuck in most retellings was not about wealth but about accountability. A company that could have buried a complaint instead chose transparency. Mark's suspension turned into a longer investigation. Past complaints were unearthed and examined. He was offered a path that combined restitution and accountability, a chance at rehabilitation through mandatory training and community service, or termination if evaluations showed no sincere change. He chose to fight for his job. Then, after weeks of review and a hearing that did not end up on the evening news, he resigned. In the months that followed, he would speak to a counselor, find new work, and sometimes, when he was quiet, call his sister and tell her he regretted more than being embarrassed. He regretted how he had lived his days. For the passengers who had been in that car, the incident became a story that carried a moral. The businessman who had judged quickly reached out to Anna with a handwritten note apologizing for his earlier remark. The young mother offered to babysit if Anna's parents needed a break. Small human gestures filled in the gap that public actions could not. At home that evening, Robert and Anna sat at the kitchen table while Lena set out tea. They did not celebrate in any ostentatious way. Instead, they sat and spoke about responsibility. "You handled yourself well," Robert said, reaching across the table to take her hand. She shrugged. "I still hated it." "You're allowed to hate it," he said. "But you did something important. You didn't make it about what we own. You let the system do its work." "And it worked," Anna said. The words felt heavier than she expected. "I always wondered when you'd step in." He smiled, small, private. "I don't like stepping in just to make a scene. I like stepping in to make it right. There's a difference." The town told the story in dozens of small versions, on neighborhood message boards, over coffee in diners, on the next morning's commuter trains. The version that survived was not the one about privileges used as a blunt instrument. It was the one about accountability, about a company that chose to listen to its passengers and employees rather than bury an uncomfortable truth. Anna learned something about herself that week. She learned that standing still could be a form of strength. She learned that the quietness her father prized was not a cloak to hide behind but a tool to choose when to speak and how to act. And she learned that power is not evidenced only by the ability to shut someone down. Sometimes it's shown by building systems that prevent harm before it happens. Robert learned too. He doubled down on the training programs he'd begun, made sure complaints were tracked and escalated with clarity, and he tightened the way hire and review processes worked for frontline staff. He did this not out of shame or revenge, but out of the belief that the small acts of cruelty that go unexamined warp entire cultures. A couple months later, Anna took a different route home on a rain-heavy evening. She watched the raindrops streak the window, the same way she had the day Mark humiliated her. She thought about Alonzo, about Claire, and about the woman who'd recorded the video. They had all, in their small ways, decided the moment mattered. That's what changed things. Quiet people noticing, acting. If you've ever been humiliated in public, or stood by and watched someone else be treated poorly, know this. The smallest acts of courage, filming an incident, telling the truth, refusing to look away, accumulate. They become the architecture of accountability. So if this story holds anything for you, let it be this. Do not mistake silence for weakness. And do not mistake quiet power for passivity. There are different kinds of courage. There is the roar, and there is the steady, unflashy kind that builds systems, speaks when necessary, and pushes for change that lasts. If the story moved you, share it. If it reminded you of something you've experienced, tell it. Your voice matters. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that look at the quiet moments and the hard choices. And one last line to carry with you, because it's true in more places than just railways. Sometimes the quietest person in the room owns the whole building. Sometimes, more importantly, they change the rules for everyone inside it.